In this slide, we are going to begin talking about the process called placentation. And as you might guess, it's the formation of the placenta, which is a super important temporary organ that's going to originate from embryonic and maternal tissue. The word placenta sort of means flat cake, and a placenta actually looks like a pancake structure. So the embryonic portion of the placenta is going to include the inner cell mass, which gives rise to a layer of extra embryonic mesoderm that lines the inner surface of the trophoblast. Together, these structures are going to form the chorion, and the chorion is going to develop these finger-like projections called the chorionic villi. Recall the villi that we've talked about in the digestive system. The villi are then invaded by new blood vessels, which extend to the embryo as umbilical arteries and veins. So if we zoom in a little bit more here, we can see some of these layers. So in this image, we see what's called the decidua basalis and the decidua capsularis. The decidua basalis is the endometrium beneath the embryo, and the decidua capsularis is the layer which is surrounding the uterine cavity. We can see the chorion formed here. And then the chorion is going to develop these finger-like projections, which are called chorionic villi. So we can see chorionic villi shown here on this image. This is showing the decidua basalis, the stratum basalis of endometrium. Remember, that's the layer that's not responsive to hormones. The fetal portion of the placenta, and then these blood vessels, which are going to come out of the umbilical cord, which we're going to talk about coming up. So the placenta itself is going to be a combination of the chorionic villi, which we just saw, and the decidua basalis. And the placenta is going to be a super, super important structure that is fully functional by the end of the first trimester. So after the first 3 months. And the placenta plays a very important role for many things. It provides a nutritive role. It is essentially the fetus's respiratory system, excretory system. So this is going to include digestive system, for example, as well as the endocrine system. So the placenta is a temporary organ that provides many of these functions. Remember, the placenta secretes HCG from the beginning until production of estrogens and progesterones increase. If the placental hormones are inadequate when the HCG levels wane, the endometrium does unfortunately degenerate and the pregnancy is aborted. So throughout pregnancy, those levels of estrogens and progesterones are going to continue to increase because they need to prepare the mammary glands for afterbirth during lactation. So the placenta also secretes HPL, which is human placental lactogen, human chorionic thyrotropin, and a hormone called relaxin, which is going to be for birth, to help relax the pubic symphysis to open up the birth canal. On the next slide, we are seeing embryonic development, and some of the important extra embryonic membranes would be membranes like the amnion, which is the membrane that's going to surround where the amniotic cavity would. Also, the yolk sac. And the yolk sac plays a larger role in other animals, but in humans, it does play a role early on as part of the GI tract. And also, the most important role is production of earlier on red blood cells. The third layer is what is called the allantois. And the allantois is the basis for the umbilical cord and part of the urinary bladder. And finally, the chorion is the fourth extra embryonic membrane. It's going to enclose the embryonic body and helps to form the placenta. And we've already talked about how the chorion then develops into this chorionic villus, which you can see a little later on in fetal development in the 13-week fetus. So in the captions, it shows what is occurring at each stage here. So early on, during that window of implantation, the syncytio trophoblast is eroding that endometrium. Implantation is complete by day 12, so that's an important marker to know. The embryo then is going to exhibit all three germ layers, which we're going to talk about next at day 16. And then the 4.5-week embryo, we see the decidua capsularis, basalis, amnion, yolk sac, and the chorion villi are within the endometrium. So during this process of implantation, the blastocyst is being converted into what's called a gastrula. The gastrula has these three germ layers, and the inner cell mass divides into what's called an epiblast and a hypoblast, which are subdivided inner cell mass that's now called the embryonic disc. So the inner cell mass is super, super important, and it's going to be responsible for development of embryonic organ systems. On our next slide, we are going to see a flow chart of the germ layers here, and you don't need to know every single thing that's shown in this slide. What's happening is there's the epiblast is separating into these three different germ layers. So to kind of make it a little easier to remember, think of ecto as just being the nervous system as well as the skin epidermis. So you don't have to necessarily remember all the structures that are in here. For example, you don't have to remember chromaffin cells, neural crest derivatives, etc. Then if you think of the opposite extreme, the endoderm, which if we look at that prefix, it looks like inside, it's going to be the epithelial linings. Also, it's going to be the digestive and respiratory tracts, as well as the urogenital tracts. So if you know those two, that means that everything else is going to be from the mesoderm.